next speaker, I tell you, for one day, every time I was speaking about the next speaker, the only comments that I got was, he's a genius. Oh, he's unbelievable. He's amazing. So I thought, I didn't know him, so I was really curious, and I'm really curious to hear his presentation. I think first time he's here in Italy, so for the first time here in Italy, Fabrice Grinda. Hello, Fabrice. Welcome here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here.
You know, I think with an introduction like that, my ego and you guys might not be able to fit in the room anymore. So, I mean, we live in a time where basically we're being bombarded by negativity. People are talking about like global warming, Syrian conflict, Euro crisis, sovereign debt crisis, financial crisis. You know, it looks like, if you could look across Europe, the mood is morose and the prognosis seemingly dire. In fact, when you think about what the general consensus is in terms of thinking, the consensus is that things are bad and are going to be bad, and the real conversation is happening around how bad are things going to get. And what I'm here to tell you is that this consensus is wrong, that we're in fact facing a wonderful future, and I want to explain to you why. So first, let me take you back to the late 1970s. In the late 1970s, it looked like the end of Western civilization. We had two oil shocks around the world. We had stagflation with unemployment and inflation above 10% across Western countries. We had the Shah who had fallen in Iran. You had the Soviet Union, which had invaded Afghanistan. You had the US, which had lost Vietnam. And you had dictatorships across Latin America, Eastern Europe. It really looked like the very basis of Western civilization was crumbling. And no one at that time predicted the extraordinary times that were ahead. Over the last 40 years, we've had democracies extend across Eastern Europe, Latin America, and Southern Europe. We've had the greatest creation of wealth in the history of humanity. We've had 1 billion people come out of poverty in the last 35 years. In China alone, 650 million people came out of poverty, completely changing urban landscapes, not just in cities like Shanghai and Beijing, but in Shenzhen and frankly across the country as a whole. Despite record natural resources consumption for the last 40 years, we actually have more oil reserves, gas reserves than ever before. I don't know if you guys recall, but in 1973, in the Club of Rome issued a book called The Limits of Growth, and they predicted that within 40 years we'd run out of pretty much every one of the major resources. And despite 40 years of record consumption, we have more reserves than ever before. And underpinning a lot of that is the technology changes that have happened that people never predict. And when you look at the way people used to live their lives 40 years ago versus today, you'd see an office from the 1970s with not even typewriters, let alone computers. Our lives have been profoundly transformed by computers, cell phones, and the internet. And what I'm here to tell you today is that, actually, if you take a step back, on a 100-year scale, it's even more true. We've had recessions, we've had bigger downturns like the Great Depression or the oil shocks, and yet, over a history of 100 years, the history of humanity and the history as a whole is basically one of unabated, continued economic growth. On a 100-year scale, life expectancy has doubled. Per capita income is multiplied by 3, and infant mortality is divided by 10. Again, on the same 120-year scale, we see the cost of food, of energy, of communications and transportation divide by a factor of 10 to 100. For the last 130 years, global literacy went from 25% to 87%. In fact, we've actually redefined our definition of poverty. Today, someone in America who's poor, 99% of them have electricity and running water. 95% of them have a TV. 88% of them have a cell phone, and 70% of them have a car. These are riches unimaginable and unheard of to the wealthiest of people 150 years ago. They could not even fathom having them. Moreover, we're living in the most peaceful time in the history of humanity. I mean, because we're bombarded by images from Syria and around the world, we feel that we're in a violent world. But the reality, both on a 60-year time frame, embed also in the history of humanity, as a percentage of people dying of conflict, we are in the most peaceful time in our history. And the good news is that these changes, haven't just been happening and that's it, we're no longer progressing. We're actually continuing to progress. Now, the real story of the last 13 years is not the Euro crisis or the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. The real story is the rise of Africa. Africa, in the last 13 years, 6 of the top 10 fastest growing countries on a GDP per capita basis have been African. The forecast for the next 5 years is that 7 of the top 10 will be African. And Africa is now becoming integrated in the global economy the way Asia has been integrated in the global economy from the 1950s onwards, transforming the lives of billions. In Africa today, you have cell phone penetration already above 70% and rising. You have smartphone penetration at 30% and rising. It's probably expected to cross the 70% line within 5 years. As Peter Diamandis of the X Prize Foundation likes to say, a Maasai warrior in Tanzania today has more access with a regular phone to mobile communications that President Reagan did 30 years ago. So the most powerful man in the world 30 years ago has actually has the same, a Tanzanian warrior now has the same access to information. If that phone is a smartphone with Google on it, that same Tanzanian warrior has more access to information at his fingertips than President Clinton did 20 years ago, the most powerful man in the world. And so we're seeing technology become an extraordinary equalizer. And before I talk about the changes that technology and the upcoming technologies are going to bring to this world and why they make me extraordinarily optimistic, I also want to talk about low-hanging fruits that exist in actually bringing existing technologies to bear in areas that have yet to be touched by technology. So in most Western countries, public spending, education, and healthcare represent over 50% of GDP. And these are areas that have been barely touched by the technology revolution. And because we live in a time of austerity, people have been saying governments should do less with less. But the reality is we have an extraordinary opportunity to do more with less. If you look at countries like Estonia that are leading the way with existing technologies, in Estonia in 2011, 24% of the people voted at the last elections online. 93% of people pay their taxes online. You can set up a company online in minutes. All parents have access to their students' homework or their kids' homework, their grades and attendance records online. All medical records are online. They've created a centralized database where they pull information from the various data providers to have one centralized medical record. And all this using relatively inexpensive off-the-shelf technologies. Now, beyond using existing technologies to transform our economies, there are changes afoot in all of the main components of our economies that are going to be revolutionized. In manufacturing, in healthcare, in education, in communications, in transportation, in energy, in food, and in water. In manufacturing, you're already seeing 3D printing that has revolutionized prototyping. We're now seeing much more rapid prototyping and innovation in hardware than we've seen ever before, both because of 3D printing and because of things like Kickstarter that is democratizing the creation of hardware startups. We're now seeing actually 3D printing being integrated with mass manufacturing methods. And so today, 25% of the 3D printed output is already ready to be used components. So it's no longer just in prototyping, it's actually integrated in manufacturing. And we're also seeing its potential in healthcare with the printing of organs, which is now in the labs, but it looks like we'll have a reasonably cost-effective means of printing organs within 5 to 10 years. And 10 years probably after FDA approval, et cetera. And that's suggesting that the organ shortage will go away, that we'll have rejection issues will go away as the organs will be printed with your own DNA and genetic makeup. Healthcare is finally on the way to having a revolution. So Watson, which is IBM's supercomputer, which famously won Jeopardy, is now more capable of identifying certain types of cancers than doctors. Now that actually makes intuitive sense. A computer doesn't get tired, it doesn't get bored. It can look at every micron or a millimeter of an MRI or an X-ray and identify issues that doctors are going to miss. Now, Watson is estimated to have cost $21 million to develop and build, but today's $21 million supercomputer is tomorrow's $100 cell phone. So we can imagine a world in the future where medical diagnosis will mostly be automated and more effective and cheaper than the ones with doctors today. In fact, we're probably 5 years down from having a Star Trek-like medical tricorder, basically a cell phone type size device that can identify and diagnose almost most common illnesses, essentially for free, for a few $100s per device. And these are not only are there a number of prizes around developing it, but there are a number of companies going after this. And so we're basically 5 years away, probably, at the most 10, from completely revolutionizing healthcare diagnosticing. Education is also on the verge of a revolution. If you take Socrates and you fast forward him 2,500 years in the future to today's world, one of the few things he would recognize is actually the way we teach our kids. We have a teacher of varying quality spewing facts to students of varying quality. And it makes no sense that we're still teaching our kids the same way we did it 2,500 years ago. There's been attempts now in a number of high schools in the US where they've actually computerized the education process, where each student gets material dedicated to them relative to their level with continuous gamified testing. This way, they can't be talking to their neighbor because they have to be answering questions all the time, and they're engaged because it's exactly at their level and a little bit challenging. So the role of the teacher is going to be transformed from being a fact-spewing machine to being a personal coach, a personal consultant to help people become better. At the same time, education is finally becoming scalable. We're seeing now on Udacity and Coursera, which are two of the MOOCs, the best professors have hundreds of thousands of students. And so we're starting to see, and technology is becoming a great equalizer. You can now take classes from the best teachers in the world, regardless of your age, gender, race, and location, or GDP per capita. You can be in Pakistan and learning programming or electrical engineering. And it's also going to redefine the way we think about education. To date, education has been something we do through high school, maybe college or after, and that's it. But as the needs for our skills changes, people are going to basically have continuous education. You'll continue improving it, if only for yourself or as an intellectual simulation. And so things like Coursera, Udacity, Khan Academy, Code Academy, et cetera, will allow you to continue improving your skills throughout your life. Now, transportation is also on the verge of a revolution. Again, it's one of the things that hasn't seemingly changed for a long time. But every year in the US, to congestion and traffic accidents and the cost of fuel because of because people are in congestion, there's $121 billion of economic productivity that is wasted. Globally, we have about 50 million accidents a year. 1.2 million people die in accidents every year. We're talking about like trillions of dollars of wasted economic activity. And it used to be that people thought, well, if you want to have self-driving cars, you're going to need to replace your infrastructure. You need new highways. But that's not true. Google has proven that we have the technology today to actually put self-driving cars on the road that are perfectly safe, and they use a combination of radar and GPS, et cetera. They can read street signs, and they can avoid regular people and other cars. And they become even safer when the other cars on the road are also self-driving cars. Now, this is expensive today, but all these technologies are following a Moore's Law type improvement schedule. And we're starting to see these technologies seep down into traditional car manufacturing. You already have cars on the high end that brake automatically when there's traffic ahead, that can park themselves. Elon Musk, I think a week or two ago, of Tesla announced that he will have a Tesla on the road within 3 years that can drive itself for 90% of the trips. Now, it might be 5 years away, but with these types of improvements, it's very easy to imagine a world where 10 years from now, again, not an extraordinarily long time into the future, 10 years from now, most or many of the trips driven by cars will be self-driven, and we will not be at the helm. Communications is also on the verge of a revolution. Now, this seems or sounds very sci-fi, but the reality is it's already there in the lab. I can put you in an MRI machine, a special EFMRI machine, make you watch a movie and read that movie from your brain. If I put a special helmet with 128 electrodes on your head connected to a supercomputer, with enough practice today, you can learn to fly a plane. You can learn to fly a helicopter. You can project text. Now, of course, today you need a supercomputer. You need a very unwieldy hat full of electrodes. But project that 10 years down the line, and it's not inconceivable to imagine that you're going to be able to basically control your cell phone, which will probably be something like your glasses, through your mind. You will no longer need, you know, a phone per se, given that you can actually make all the controls happen through your mind. Now, the reason things like Google Glasses will probably make sense is we don't yet have mind-to-mind communication. The development of mind-to-mind communication is slower, so it'll be mind to your cell phone, to your glasses, that'll be sending text to another person with their glasses, you know, probably with lasers projecting the retina, where they can read whatever you have to say. In the longer term, though, and longer term meaning 20 years down the line, is going to be mind-to-mind. And 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, there was already the first demonstration of mind-to-mind communications happening, and that's the image that you see behind me. And again, this sounds like science fiction. We're talking 10 years down the line. People in general have a hard time imagining how much our lives have changed. 10 years ago, none of us had smartphones. None of us had these general computing devices that basically empower our lives completely. Now, maybe the thing that makes me the most optimistic is how we're going to move away from a carbon-based economy in this 21st century. And we're going to do it regardless of government regulation and subsidies, regardless of basically anything. Now, the concept that we're going to run out of energy is ludicrous. We're getting enough energy from the sun every 12 minutes to power our economies for an entire year. So the issue is not the abundance of energy, the issue is the accessibility of energy. And this is a problem we've faced many times before. If I take you back 150 years, aluminum was the most expensive metal in the world. It was more expensive than gold, it was more expensive than platinum or silver. And the reason is, aluminum doesn't exist in natural form, even though it's a very common component. 7% of the Earth's core is aluminum. It's the third most abundant metal on Earth. But until 1886, when the electrolysis was invented, it was extremely rare. And that's why the tip of the Washington Monument in DC is in aluminum, or when Napoleon III welcomed the King of Siam to a dinner, he himself kept gold-plated utensils, and he gave aluminum utensils. But the cost of aluminum has completely collapsed from $585 a pound, you know, in today's dollars in the 1850s to less than $1 a pound. And it collapsed extremely rapidly after 1886 when electrolysis was invented. Now, the same thing is about to happen, or is happening in solar. Solar, getting a watt of energy from, or creating a solar panel that can extract a watt of energy cost about $70 in 1977. It was down to 74 cents in this year. So basically, we've been seeing, through a combination of decreases in cost of production and increases in productivity, a 14% year-on-year improvement for 40 years, basically, in solar. We're on the verge, we've reached basically grid parity in solar in some remote places of India and Thailand, et cetera. We're about 10 years from reaching grid parity in solar in sunny places in the Western world, like California or Spain, and probably 20 years from reaching grid parity, frankly, across the world. And when that happens, and I'm talking about all this without any disruptive innovation in fusion or disruptive innovation in solar itself. And so by 2050, without actually any subsidies or anything, just because it becomes the cheapest form of energy around, we're going to have moved our grid to solar. Now, what's really interesting is once the marginal megawatt of energy is zero, it changes everything. Imagine 40 years ago, computing power was so powerful, so expensive, we had to limit access to computers. We would only give you access to a computer 20 minutes at a time. Today, our cell phones are more powerful than the most powerful supercomputers at the time, and we have so much computing power, we can waste it. And because we can waste it, we can do such creative things as play Angry Birds or Clash of Clans or check our Facebook status. Once energy becomes plentiful and we can waste it, it changes everything, because all of a sudden, things like water shortages go away. The fact, or the thinking that water we're going to have a water shortage makes no sense. 70% of the Earth is water. Now, the issue is 1.3% of that is fresh water that is near ground level. But once you have unlimited energy, you can desalinate. And that's without even thinking of innovations that are happening. This is a slingshot device that can purify about 1,000 liters of fresh water per day from almost any water source, including polluted rivers and saline sources. Likewise, if you have unlimited fresh water, not necessarily from this, but even just from having free energy, you no longer have a food shortage problem because you can grow crops in the desert. And that's without even considering the improvements that are happening in farming with things like vertical farms that are on the horizon. And so basically, we are extremely privileged as people. We are living not only in the richest, safest, and period of history, in the history of humanity, we're also on the verge of transformations that are going to change this world for the better. And here, as entrepreneurs and as investors, we're even more blessed because we are helping create this better world of tomorrow, a world with better equality of opportunity and of plenty. Thank you.
Fabrice Grinda, thank you. Excellent,
Thank
very
you.
good. Thank you so much. I could do this one. Thank you so much. Wow.